February 25th, 2005. Lunchtime in Park City, Kansas. Dennis Rader is driving home from work. He's the city compliance officer, the guy who writes citations for overgrown lawns and junked cars. Just another Friday. Just another normal day in a completely ordinary life. He's been married to Paula for 34 years, has 2 grown kids, serves as president of his church council, teaches Sunday school, volunteers with the Boy Scouts. At 59 years old, Dennis Rader is exactly what he appears to be. A boring, uptight, middle-aged bureaucrat. A stickler for rules. A little annoying, maybe, but harmless. Except he's not. As Rader turns onto his street, he notices something odd. There are cars everywhere. Police cars, unmarked sedans, officers standing in yards watching the road. For a split second, he thinks maybe there's been an accident, a gas leak, something routine. And then they move. 6 officers surround his black Jeep Cherokee, guns drawn, shouting commands. "Dennis Rader, turn off your vehicle. Put your hands where we can see them." Rader complies, slowly, carefully, his mind racing, trying to figure out what's happening, what mistake he made, how they found him. An officer yanks open the door, pulls him out, spins him around, slams him against the hood of his car. "Dennis Lynn Rader, you're under arrest for 10 counts of first-degree murder." And just like that, after 31 years, 10 murders, and countless taunting letters, BTK's reign of terror is over. But here's what you need to understand about this arrest. Dennis Rader didn't get caught because the police finally outsmarted him. He didn't slip up after decades of careful planning. He got caught because his ego, that desperate, insatiable need for recognition, wouldn't let him stay silent. His intent? The same intent that drove him to kill, to photograph, to pose bodies, to write letters. That need to be seen, to be known, to prove he was smarter than everyone else. That's what destroyed him. This is part 2 of the BTK story, the resurrection of a killer who couldn't stay dead, the letters that brought him back into the light, and the single technical mistake that ended everything. Intent doesn't lie. People do. I'm Carmen Carrion, and this is Deadly Intent, the show where we dig into the psychology behind the crime, the intent that drives someone to do the unthinkable. Last week we covered Dennis Rader's rise as the BTK killer. From 1974 to 1971, he murdered 10 people in Wichita, Kansas. He sent taunting letters to the media, demanded recognition, proved he could kill in plain sight and never get caught. And then, in 1991, he just stopped, went silent, disappeared into his mundane life as a compliance officer, church volunteer, and family man. For 13 years, BTK was a ghost, a cold case, a boogeyman that Wichita was trying to forget. But Dennis Rader couldn't forget, because for him, the killings were never just about the victims. They were about the attention, the recognition, the proof that he was special, superior, untouchable. And when that attention faded, when Wichita started to move on without him, his ego couldn't handle it. So in 2004, he came back, and in coming back, he made the mistakes that would finally bring him down. Today we're covering 2004 to 2005, the return of BTK, the investigation that became a psychological chess match, and the floppy disk that ended it all. Let's pick up where we left off. January 2004. 30 years after the Otero murders, the Wichita Eagle decides to run a retrospective piece on the BTK case. It's a significant anniversary. 3 decades since 4 members of the Otero family were brutally murdered in their home. 3 decades since BTK first terrorized Wichita. The article is titled, "BTK Case Unsolved, 30 Years Later." It talks about the investigation, the murders, the letters, the long silence, and it speculates about what might have happened to BTK. Maybe he died. Maybe he's in prison for another crime. Maybe he moved away and is killing somewhere else. The article treats BTK like a historical footnote, a cold case, a relic of Wichita's dark past. And Dennis Rader reads it, and he's furious. Think about his intent for a second. Everything Dennis Rader has ever done, every murder, every letter, every photograph, has been about recognition, about being seen, about proving he's special. For 13 years he's been silent, living his normal life, satisfying his urges through stalking, breaking into homes, taking trophies, reliving his memories through photographs. But this article, this dismissive, speculative article, treating him like he's dead or gone or irrelevant, it's intolerable. It violates the core of who he is. His intent was never just to kill. It was to be known for killing, to have people understand that he was smarter than them, more powerful, in control. And Wichita has forgotten him. So Dennis Rader decides to remind them. On March 19th, 2004, the Wichita Eagle receives a letter. Inside the envelope is a photocopy of Vicki Wegerle's driver's license, the one he stole when he killed her in 1986. There are also 3 photographs of her body at the crime scene, photos only the killer could have taken. The letter is short, direct, and it makes one thing clear. BTK is back. The police go into crisis mode. After 18 years of silence, after the case has gone completely cold, BTK has resurfaced. And he's not just claiming responsibility for an old murder. He's providing proof, evidence only the killer would have. Police Chief Norman Williams holds a press conference. He confirms that the communication appears genuine, that BTK is active again, that the investigation is being reopened with full resources, and the media goes wild. Suddenly, BTK is front page news again. National news. Everyone is talking about the killer who disappeared for nearly 2 decades and just came back. Cable news stations are running specials. Podcasts are launching. Wichita is terrified all over again. And Dennis Rader is thrilled, because this is what he wanted. This is what he needed. The attention, the recognition, the knowledge that everyone is talking about him again. His intent has been satisfied. For now. But here's the thing about that kind of intent. It's never satisfied for long. The attention is like a drug, and Dennis Rader is addicted. So he keeps waiting. Over the next 10 months, Dennis Rader sends 11 communications to various media outlets and police departments around Wichita. Letters, packages, puzzles, each one more elaborate than the last. In May 2004, he sends a package to KAKE-TV containing word puzzles and what he calls Chapter 1 of the BTK story, a narrative he's writing about himself. In June, he leaves a package at a drop site near a Home Depot. Inside are more word puzzles, more chapters, and a necklace he claims to have taken from one of his victims. In July, he sends another letter claiming responsibility for a 1986 murder that police hadn't connected to BTK. He includes details only the killer would know. Each communication is carefully crafted. Each one is designed to prove he's still out there, still dangerous, still smarter than the police. But here's what's interesting about Rader's intent during this period. He's not killing anyone. He's 59 years old now. The physical risks are too high. His urges have faded somewhat with age. But the need for recognition hasn't faded at all. If anything, it's gotten stronger. So he's replaced the act of killing with the act of communication. He's turned the investigation into a performance, a game, a way to prove his intellectual superiority without the risk of actually committing another murder. His intent isn't to kill anymore. It's to be known, to control the narrative, to make everyone acknowledge that he's still the smartest person in the room. And the police are walking a very careful line. On one hand, they need to keep him talking. Every communication is a potential clue, a potential mistake. The more he sends, the better their chances of catching him. On the other hand, they can't let him think they're scared, can't give him the satisfaction of knowing he's in control. So they start responding. Not directly, they can't risk encouraging him too much, but through the media, through carefully worded press conferences, through classified ads in the newspaper asking him to clarify certain details. And Rader eats it up, because this is exactly what he wants. A dialogue, an audience, proof that the police are paying attention, that he matters. One particularly revealing communication, Rader sends a package containing a doll, a Barbie doll, bound and gagged with a plastic bag over its head. He's recreated one of his crime scenes in miniature. It's disturbing, grotesque, and it tells the police something important about his psychology. He's still fantasizing, still reliving the murders, still getting gratification from the memory of what he did. His intent hasn't changed at all. He just doesn't need to kill anymore to satisfy it. The attention, the recognition, the performance, that's enough now. But the police are learning too. With every communication, they're building a profile, narrowing down the suspect pool, analyzing handwriting, word choice, paper type, locations where packages are dropped. They know he's local, lives or works in the Wichita area, knows the city well, has access to photocopiers and computers, is organized, methodical, obsessed with control. They're getting closer. And then, in December 2004, Dennis Rader makes a critical mistake. December 2004, BTK sends another package to KAKE-TV. Inside is a word puzzle, more chapters of his autobiography, and something new, a question. Rader wants to know if it's safe to communicate via floppy disk. Specifically, he asks, "Can you trace a floppy disk back to a specific computer if I send you one?" And this is where we see the full scope of Dennis Rader's psychological blind spot. He spent 30 years outsmarting the police, evading capture, proving he's intellectually superior, and he genuinely believes that he's smarter than everyone else. But he doesn't understand technology. He's 59 years old. He works as a compliance officer for a small suburb. He's not tech-savvy. He doesn't understand metadata or digital forensics or how modern computers track information. So he asks, because in his mind, the police will give him an honest answer. And here's where the Wichita Police Department makes a brilliant tactical decision. They lie. They respond to his question through a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle. The ad is coded so that only BTK will understand, but the message is clear. No, a floppy disk cannot be traced. It's safe to use. And Dennis Rader believes them. Let's talk about intent here, because Rader's intent in asking this question reveals everything about his psychology. He wants to escalate, wants to send more detailed communications, maybe documents typed on a computer instead of handwritten letters. It's easier, faster, more efficient. But he also wants to stay in control, wants to be sure he's not taking unnecessary risks. So he asks the people hunting him if it's safe to give them evidence that could identify him. And when they tell him yes, he believes them, because fundamentally, despite all his murders and letters and games, Dennis Rader is not actually that smart. He's narcissistic, yes. Organized, yes. Methodical, yes. But he's not the criminal mastermind he believes himself to be. He's a deeply insecure man who's built his entire identity around feeling superior to others, and that need to feel superior blinds him to his own limitations. His intent is to maintain control while continuing the game. But his ego makes him vulnerable, and on February 16, 2005, he sends the floppy disk. The package arrives at KSAS-TV on February 16, 2005. Inside is a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk, the kind that was already becoming obsolete in 2005. Most people had moved on to CDs, USB drives, email attachments, but Dennis Rader is old school, and he trusts that the police told him the truth. The police take the disk and immediately bring it to their computer forensics team. And within hours, they have everything they need, because here's what Dennis Rader didn't understand. When you create a document on a computer, that document stores metadata, information about when it was created, when it was last modified, and, critically, what computer it was created on. The floppy disk contains a Microsoft Word document, and embedded in that document's metadata is a name, Dennis, and the name of the computer it was last saved on, a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. The forensics team pulls up the church's website, and there, listed as president of the Congregation Council, is Dennis Rader. They run his name through databases, and they find him. Dennis Lynn Rader, age 59, lives in Park City, works as a compliance officer, married, 2 kids, no criminal record. On the surface, he's exactly the kind of boring, unremarkable, law-abiding citizen who would never be a suspect in a serial murder investigation. But the DNA doesn't lie. See, back in 1974, when Rader murdered the Otero family, he left semen at the scene. That evidence has been sitting in storage for 31 years, waiting for technology to catch up. Now, in 2005, DNA analysis is routine, reliable, conclusive. But the police have a problem. They can't just walk up to Dennis Rader and ask for a DNA sample. If they do, and he realizes he's a suspect, he could run, destroy evidence, hurt someone. So they get creative. Rader's daughter Carrie is living in Michigan. She's a normal young woman, married, living her life, with no idea that her father is a serial killer. The police contact her under the guise of investigating a routine matter. They ask if she would be willing to provide a DNA sample to rule out a potential genetic link in a cold case they're working. She agrees, because why wouldn't she? She has nothing to hide. And when the lab runs the analysis, they find what they're looking for, a familial match. Carrie's DNA is consistent with being the daughter of the person who left semen at the Otero crime scene. It's not absolute proof that Dennis Rader is BTK, but it's enough for a warrant. The police put together a surveillance team. They watch Rader's house, track his movements, build a timeline of his daily routine, and on February 25, 2005, they make their move. It's just afternoon. Dennis Rader is driving home from his morning rounds as a compliance officer. He's planning to grab lunch, then head back to work. It's been a good few months. The BTK communications have put him back in the spotlight. The media is obsessed with him again. He's been watching the news coverage, reading the articles, savoring the attention. His intent, that core need to be recognized, to be known, to prove his superiority, has been satisfied more fully than it has in years. He feels in control, and then he turns onto his street and sees the police. 6 officers surrounded his vehicle, guns drawn, shouting at him to put his hands up, turn off the engine, get out of the car slowly. Rader complies, because what else can he do? They spin him around, cuff him, read him his rights. Dennis Lynn Rader, you're under the arrest for 10 counts of first-degree murder. And in that moment, Dennis Rader's entire world collapses. For 31 years, he's lived 2 completely separate lives. Dennis, the compliance officer, the church president, the Boy Scout leader, the boring suburban dad, and BTK the killer, the phantom, the untouchable genius who could murder in plain sight and never get caught. He's kept those identities so carefully separated that nobody, not his wife, not his kids, not his neighbors, not his co-workers, ever suspected a thing. And now, in one moment, those identities are crashing together. The police take him to Sedgwick County Jail, put him in an interrogation room, and then they start asking questions. And Dennis Rader, who has spent 3 decades carefully guarding his secrets, who has never once slipped up or confessed or given anything away, starts talking. Because here's the thing about Dennis Rader. He wants to be known. He wants people to understand how smart he is, how careful he was, how he pulled it off. His intent, even now, even in custody, is to be recognized for what he did. So when the detectives ask him about the murders, he doesn't lawyer up. He doesn't stay silent. He doesn't deny anything. He tells them everything in excruciating detail. The confession lasts more than 30 hours. Dennis Rader sits across from Detective Ken Landwehr and FBI Special Agent Ray London, and he tells them the story of every single murder. He describes the Otero family, how he cut the phone line, how he waited, how he tied them up one by one, how Joseph Sr. fought harder than he expected, how he had to strangle Julie twice because she kept reviving, how he took Josephine to the basement and hanged her while masturbating. He uses clinical language, detached, like he's describing a home improvement project, not the murder of 4 people, including 2 children. He talks about Catherine Bright, how Kevin fought back, how frustrated he was when the plan fell apart, how he stabbed Catherine 11 times because strangling wasn't enough. He describes Shirley Vian, The children crying in that bathroom. How he told Shirley he just had a sexual problem and he needed to tie her up. How he comforted her when she threw up, got her a glass of water, then strangled her anyway. Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicki Wegerly, Dolores Davis. Every murder, every detail, every moment of planning and execution and gratification. The detectives listen, take notes, record everything. And what becomes clear very quickly is that Dennis Rader doesn't feel guilty. He doesn't feel remorse. He doesn't regret what he did. He's proud of it. He talks about his crimes the way someone might talk about a difficult but successful career, with satisfaction, with a sense of accomplishment. At one point, he refers to his victims as projects, clinical, dehumanized, objects in a fantasy, not people with lives and families and futures. And then the detective asks him about the floppy disk. "You told us it couldn't be traced," Rader says. There's a note of betrayal in his voice, like they broke some unspoken rule of the game. "Yeah," Detective Landwehr says, "we lied." And Dennis Rader looks genuinely shocked, because in his mind, this was a game, a dialogue, a test of intellectual superiority. And in games, you don't cheat. But this was never a game. This was a murder investigation. 10 people were dead. Families were destroyed. A city lived in fear for decades. And Dennis Rader is so deep in his own narcissistic delusion that he can't see the difference. His intent, right up to the moment of his arrest and even through his confession, is to be recognized, to have people acknowledge his intelligence, his skill, his superiority. He genuinely believes that if he explains it well enough, people will understand, will appreciate what he accomplished, will see him the way he sees himself, as special. But that's not what happens. June 27, 2005. Dennis Rader appears in court for his arraignment. The courtroom is packed. Victims, families, media, curious onlookers. Everyone wants to see the man who terrorized Wichita for 3 decades. And what they see is disappointing. Dennis Rader looks exactly like what he is, a boring, middle-aged bureaucrat. Thinning hair, glasses, unremarkable features. The kind of person you'd pass on the street and forget immediately. There's no visible evil, no monster, just a man. And that's almost more disturbing than if he looked dangerous, because it drives home the reality that monsters don't look like monsters. They look like your neighbor, your coworker, the guy teaching Sunday school. Rader's lawyer, Steve Osborne, tries to negotiate a plea deal, but there's nothing to negotiate. The evidence is overwhelming. The confession is recorded. The DNA matches. So on June 27, 2005, Dennis Rader pleads guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. And the judge does something unusual. He asks Rader to describe each murder in detail for the court record. This is important for several reasons. First, it ensures there's no question about his guilt. Second, it prevents any future appeals based on an inadequate confession. Then, it gives the victims' families a chance to hear what happened directly from the killer himself. But there's something else happening too. The judge is giving Dennis Rader exactly what he wants: a platform, an audience, a chance to be known. And Rader takes it. For hours he stands at the podium and describes each murder: clinical, detached, proud. He uses his own terminology: projects, trolling, hits. He describes his methods, his planning, his execution. He talks about the victims like they were objects in an experiment. At one point, he describes how he posed Josephine Otero's body in the basement, how he photographed her, how he masturbated while she died. And in the gallery, Charlie Otero, who found his family's bodies when he was 15 years old, sits and listens, tears streaming down his face, because Dennis Rader's intent has never changed. Even here, even now, even facing 10 consecutive life sentences, he still needs to be recognized, still needs people to know what he did, still needs to feel superior. The performance is the point. It always has been. On August 18, 2005, Dennis Rader is sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in prison. Because Kansas didn't have the death penalty during the years he committed his crimes, life in prison is the harshest sentence available. He will never be eligible for parole. He will die in prison. And as the judge reads the sentence, Dennis Rader shows no emotion, no remorse, no fear, just the same detached clinical demeanor he's had throughout the entire process. Because in his mind, he's already won. He got the attention, the recognition, the acknowledgement that he's special. His intent has been satisfied. The impact of Dennis Rader's crimes extends far beyond the 10 people he murdered. Paula Rader, his wife of 34 years, files for an emergency divorce. The divorce is granted immediately, waiving the normal 60-day waiting period. She gives interviews later saying she had no idea, no clue that the man she had lived with for 3 decades was capable of this. And the evidence suggests she's telling the truth. Dennis Rader compartmentalized so completely that nobody in his family suspected anything. Boring, controlling, rule-obsessed dad. His children, Brian and Carrie, are devastated. Their entire understanding of their father, their childhood, their family history is shattered. Carrie Rader, now Carrie Rawson after her marriage, eventually writes a book about her experience, A Serial Killer's Daughter, My Story of Faith, Love, and Overcoming. In it, she describes the moment police showed up at her door in Michigan and told her that her father was BTK. The disbelief, the horror, the complete upheaval of everything she thought she knew about her life. She describes loving her father because he was a good dad, by all accounts, present, involved, supportive, and then reconciling that love with the knowledge of what he did, who he really was. It's a kind of trauma that's almost impossible to comprehend. The victims' families, meanwhile, finally have answers. After decades of wondering, waiting, hoping for justice, they finally know who killed their loved ones and why. But the why doesn't bring much comfort, because there is no why. Not really. Not in any way that makes sense. Dennis Rader killed because he wanted to, because it made him feel powerful, because he enjoyed it, because his intent, his core psychological need for control and recognition, demanded it. There's no deep meaning, no tragic backstory that explains it, no abuse or trauma that created him. He's just a narcissist who discovered that killing people satisfied his need for power and attention, and who spent 30 years indulging that need. And that, in some ways, is more terrifying than any explanation could be. Charlie Otero, who discovered his family's bodies in 1974, attends every single court hearing, every appearance, every opportunity to face the man who destroyed his family. He gives a victim impact statement at the sentencing. He looks Dennis Rader in the eye and tells him about the life he's lived since the day of 1974. The nightmares, the therapy, the survivor's guilt, the knowledge that if he'd come home 5 minutes earlier, he might have been killed too, or 5 minutes later, he might have saved someone. And Dennis Rader listens, but he doesn't react, doesn't apologize, doesn't show any recognition that Charlie is a human being whose life he destroyed. Because Charlie Otero was never real to Dennis Rader. None of the victims were. They were just props in a fantasy, objects to be used and discarded in service of his intent. And that's what makes him a monster. Dennis Rader is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he's been held in solitary confinement since 2005. He's now 79 years old. He'll die in that cell, but even in prison, his intent hasn't changed. Over the years, he's given interviews, written letters, corresponded with forensic psychologists and true crime authors, always seeking attention, always trying to control the narrative, always needing to be known. In 2016, forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland published Confession of a Serial Killer, the untold story of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, based on 5 years of correspondence with Rader. In those letters, Rader describes his crimes in even more detail, explains his psychology, analyzes his own behavior with the same clinical detachment he's always had. And what becomes clear is that he still doesn't get it, still doesn't understand why what he did was wrong in any fundamental sense. He understands intellectually that society says murder is bad. He understands he's in prison because he broke laws. He understands that people are angry at him. But he doesn't feel it, doesn't internalize it, doesn't experience genuine remorse or empathy or guilt. Because Dennis Rader is a psychopath. And psychopaths don't feel those things. His intent, that need for control, for recognition, for power, is still there. He just has to satisfy it in different ways now. Through letters, interviews, correspondence, whatever tiny scraps of attention he can get from inside a prison cell. In recent years, there's been speculation that Rader may have committed additional murders that haven't been attributed to him. In 2023, Oklahoma investigators announced they were looking into whether Rader was responsible for the 1976 disappearance of 16-year-old Cynthia Kinney, who vanished from a laundromat in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Rader was working for ADT at the time, and the company was installing a security system at a bank across the street from the laundromat. Rader has denied involvement, but his denials don't carry much weight. Similarly, investigators have looked at connections between Rader and other unsolved murders in Kansas during the 1970s and 1980s. Cases with similar MOs, similar victim profiles, similar levels of control and planning. It's possible we'll never know the full scope of Dennis Rader's crimes, but we do know this. His intent was always about control and recognition, and murders that didn't get attention, that didn't feed his ego. That didn't result in media coverage and police investigation and public fear. Those might not have satisfied his needs, so if there are other victims, they might have been practice, tests, experiments that didn't make the cut for his BTK identity. We may never know. The BTK case is one of the most significant serial killer investigations in American history, not just because of the body count or the duration of the killing spree, but because of what it reveals about criminal psychology and the nature of evil. Dennis Rader isn't special. He's not a criminal mastermind. He's not particularly intelligent or skilled or talented. He's just a deeply narcissistic man with no empathy who discovered that killing people made him feel powerful and important. And for 30 years, he got away with it. Not because he was brilliant, but because he was patient, methodical, careful, and lucky. But ultimately, his intent destroyed him. That need for recognition, that desperate hunger for attention, that absolute requirement that people know what he did and acknowledge his superiority. That's what brought him back in 2004. That's what made him send the letters. That's what made him ask about the floppy disk. That's what made him believe the police when they lied to him. His intent was his downfall, because intent doesn't change. It's the core of who we are. The fundamental drive that shapes our decisions and actions. For Dennis Rader, that intent was always about control and recognition. From the first murder in 1974 to the last communication in 2005, everything he did was in service of that intent. He wanted to be known, needed to be known, couldn't survive without being known. And in the end, being known is exactly what put him in prison for the rest of his life. The BTK case teaches us something important about how we think about serial killers and monsters and evil. They're not supernatural. They're not special. They're not geniuses lurking in the shadows. They're just people, deeply broken, profoundly damaged people with missing pieces where empathy and conscience should be. People who look normal, act normal, live normal lives right next to us. Dennis Rader taught Sunday school, coached Little League, volunteered with the Boy Scouts, cited people for overgrown lawns, did all the boring, mundane things that normal people do. And in between those activities, he stalked, tortured, and murdered 10 people. Both of those things were true simultaneously. Both of those identities existed in the same person. And that's the most terrifying lesson of all. The monster doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look different. It doesn't wear a sign. It looks like your neighbor, your coworker, the guy measuring your grass. Until one day it doesn't. Dennis Rader is in prison. He will die there. The people he murdered will never come back. The families he destroyed will never fully heal. But understanding his intent, understanding what drove him, what he wanted, why he did what he did, helps us understand how to recognize the warning signs, how to identify the patterns, how to maybe prevent the next one. Because intent doesn't lie. People do. Before we end, I want to take a moment to remember the people Dennis Rader murdered, because his intent was to make this story about him, to make himself the center of attention, the focus of the narrative. But this story isn't about him. It's about them. Joseph Otero, 38 years old, an Air Force veteran, A father of 5, a man starting a new life in a new city, full of hope for his family's future. Julie Otero, 33 years old, a devoted mother, a homemaker who took pride in her family and her home. Joseph Otero Jr., 9 years old, a little boy who loved his family and had his whole life ahead of him. Josephine Otero, 11 years old, a young girl with dreams and potential and a future that was stolen from her. Catherine Bright, 21 years old, a secretary, a sister, someone with her whole life ahead of her who fought like hell to survive. Shirley Vian, a young mother of 3 children who had to die knowing her kids were listening from the bathroom. Nancy Fox, 25 years old, a secretary living alone, working hard, building a life for herself. Maureen Hedge, 53 years old, Rader's neighbor, someone who trusted the man who lived down the street. Vicki Wegerly, 28 years old, a wife, a mother, someone who let a repairman into her home and paid for that trust with her life. Dolores Davis, 62 years old, a widow living alone, just trying to live her life in peace. These are the people who matter. These are the people whose stories deserve to be told. Not Dennis Rader's, theirs. Intent doesn't lie. People do. I'm Carmen Carrion, and this has been Deadly Intent. 1967. A young woman named Louisa Dunn is found brutally murdered in her Bristol, England flat. She's been sexually assaulted and strangled. The crime scene is horrific, but there are no witnesses, no clear suspects, no answers. The case goes cold. 58 years pass. Louisa's family ages. Some die never knowing who killed their daughter, their sister, their loved one. The case file gathers dust. The killer walks free. Until 2025. When DNA technology finally catches up to a 92-year-old man who thought he had gotten away with murder. Next week, we're examining the Louisa Dunn case, a story about the intent to kill, the intent to hide, and the 58 years a man spent living a normal life while carrying the weight of what he had done. What kind of person can look in the mirror every day for nearly 6 decades, knowing what they did? What kind of intent allows someone to attend family dinners, celebrate birthdays, live an entire life, all while keeping that secret? The answer tells us something profound about the criminal mind, about guilt, about conscience, or the absence of it. Intent doesn't lie. People do. I'm Carmen Carrion, and this has been Deadly Intent.